I spend my time travelling around the country, travelling around the world, talking to people about the progress and challenges that the world faces, dealing with what I see as one of the biggest challenges to humanity, which is the challenge that 1.3 billion people on our planet are struggling to get by. And along the way, I've had hundreds of conversations with people, answered hundreds of questions. And today what I wanted to share with you was some of the misconceptions, some of the assumptions that I hear from people. And I wanted to try and challenge some of them. And I want to share with you some surprising facts and insightful stories that I think mean that we can look at the issue of extreme poverty a little bit differently. I wanted to start with this myth that many of us have heard, that Africa is poor. First of all, I want to try and ask, where does that come from? For a generation, we've been brought up on photos that look a little bit like this. We see them in the media, we see them in charity advertising. We have this sense that nothing ever changes and that actually Africa's a bit of a basket case. Well, Africa's actually 54 different countries. There's a huge amount of diversity. And the time that I've spent in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, doesn't look like this at all. It looks a lot more like this. Because Africa is a continent that is full of amazing people doing amazing things. And although we might not hear all of the story a lot of the time, we should actually be really impressed with the progress that Africans themselves are making and be asking the question, what can we do to get in behind and support? And I'm proud to say, actually, that people in our country are generally pretty generous. The foreign aid that we give all around the world to Africa is about $50 billion a year. That's a lot of money. A lot of people have said, but it never makes any difference. And it's important to recognise that actually aid to Africa isn't really that much money. Remittances, money sent home by Africans themselves working overseas, are about another $40 billion a year. And you add those two things together, $90 billion, and you're still well short of the roughly $400 billion a year that predominantly leaves Africa in the form of natural resources. The question of why is Africa poor, I think, is the wrong one. The one I'm much more interested in is why are so many people in Africa still living in poverty? If we take a step back from a yearly figure like this, we can actually see that over the last 40 years or so, some $1.8 trillion worth of money has left Africa when it probably shouldn't have. This is a report that was put together last year by a group called Global Financial Integrity. And what they found was that vast amounts of money leave Africa and come here. The City of London is one of the largest financial centres of the world. The centres of Europe are also where this money goes. And the challenge I think we've got to face is asking ourselves, what is our role as citizens in a country like the United Kingdom in doing something about this? Because actually, the money that helps buy things like this, which is the £21 million mansion owned by Equatorial Guinea's Agriculture Minister, Teodorin Obiang, is, I think, a really important one. Teodorin lives in a country where 70% of people live on less than $2 a day. How he can justify spending some of his and his country's money on this house, on his 2 Bugatti Veyrons, on a golf course, on a nice swimming pool, is a little bit beyond me. But what's also beyond me is the fact that actually he puts his money in our banks. And we don't seem to see fit to ask some tough questions about that. So if we're serious about trying to see what we can do about poverty in a place like Africa, let's stop thinking that Africa, the continent, is poor and start thinking, what is it beyond just aid that we can do that's going to help us actually address some of these issues? And that leads me to a second myth, something that I hear all the time, which is this idea that poverty's getting worse. And I think it's fair to say that actually it's just not true. The World Bank put together the world's global figures on how extreme poverty is going. They in fact updated their figures last week. And since 1981, roughly 30 years ago, the world has halved the proportion of the population living in extreme poverty, from 52% of the world's population down to just 25% in 2005. And this week, it was updated to say that actually it's down to 22%, about 1.3 billion people. This is a huge success story, something that we often don't hear about, and something I think we should be incredibly proud of. Because if we ask ourselves the question, well, how did this happen? We did it by doing things like using the aid that countries like ours gave, but also the hard work of people all around the world to do things like completely eradicate a disease like smallpox. We've contained a disease like polio, which my mother had, by 99%. We've cut diphtheria rates. We've cut measles deaths in Africa by 93% in just the last 10 years. And we've cut tetanus rates by 85%. These are actually phenomenal achievements. And I wanted to take a moment just to take a step back and realise just how important it is that these changes are taking place. A disease like polio is a disease that means a lot to me. In the 1950s, my mother was one of tens of thousands of people in Australia to suffer as part of a global polio pandemic. It means that she's got one leg that's shorter than another. She can't run properly. She can't walk properly. And thanks to the global efforts of tens of thousands of people getting together, actually what we've seen is a huge transformation. In the last 23 years, polio rates are down 99.8%. Last year, there were just 650 cases of polio. And this is thanks to thousands of people in countries like ours, in countries like India and all around the world getting together and actually showing that progress is possible. In a case like polio, we've gone from 125 countries with the disease in 1988 down to just 4 last year. And some of you might have seen in the media that in fact just a few weeks ago that number dropped to 3. Because India became one of the few countries that's actually completely gotten rid of polio, largely under its own steam. They've gone an entire year without a single case of polio, and that's because they've gotten together with people from countries like ours to say we can actually do something about it. So next time you hear someone say, you know what, it's just not possible to create change, I'd like you to say, actually it is. The world's been making some absolutely huge changes and transformations in addressing big issues. And it's been done because we got together with other people to do it. And as you do that, they're likely to come back to you with a question like, but we're never going to fix poverty if people keep having so many children. And I'd like to say, well, we've got the logic here around slightly the wrong way. Because actually, I think they have too many children, or they have many children, because people are poor. It used to be that people would have a really large family. In a place like Bangladesh, 40 years ago, women had 7 children and expected a quarter of them to die. Thanks to making investments in healthcare, thanks to making sure that all girls got to stay in school, thanks for giving families access to information about fertility and family planning, Bangladesh now has roughly 2 children per woman. And only about 1 in 20 of them don't make their 5th birthday. Absolutely huge changes are possible, but we need to make sure we understand how and why. Because it used to be, back in the past, even in countries like our own, that people would have 4 kids, but 2 of them would die. They'd die from preventable diseases like diarrhea, from diseases like measles. Over the last 50 years, the world has made phenomenal progress. People still have 4 kids, but we've reduced dramatically the number of them who don't make it to their 5th birthday. That means that populations grow, and they grow rapidly. But as you just saw from Bangladesh, what happens over time is that actually, as we contain the number of kids who die, families choose to become smaller. In 2050, our planet will have 9 billion people on it. There's not really much we can do about it. But if we want to make sure it doesn't go much beyond 9 billion, it doesn't reach 10 or 11 billion, what we need to do is not say, how do we stop them from having children, but say, how do we stop poverty? How do we support people to make the decisions they want to make around their family sizes? And as we do that, you'll often hear people ask this question. Well, there's not going to be enough food if there are 9 billion people. And often implied in that is that if we keep having all these poor people with so many children, maybe it'd be easier if we just let a few of them die. Now, I don't think that's ethically acceptable. I don't think that's okay. And in fact, I also don't think it's true. Because we know from all of the data that's been collected by groups like the Food and Agriculture Organisation, there's more than enough food to feed the world. The problem is not a supply one. It's a distribution problem. And a useful way of thinking about this is instead of thinking about where is all the food, is to ask, well, what do we do with the food? Because this year, the World Food Programme, the UN agency charged with feeding the roughly 925 million people who'll go to bed hungry tonight, have a budget of around £3 billion a year. That's about a third of the food that British households will throw out. You know, the food at the back of the fridge gets a bit smelly. The leftovers we never quite get around to eating. About £420 per household. All the households across the country, about £10 billion worth a year. Because actually when we start asking questions around things like food and hunger, the challenge isn't whether or not there's enough food, it's where we choose to send it. And a useful way of thinking about that is by looking at the balance. 30% of people in sub-Saharan Africa are classified by the World Health Organization as malnourished. They're not getting enough, or they're not getting enough of the right food. The obesity rate in the UK is 26%. What we need to be thinking about is not how do we stop more people from existing, but how do we make sure that everyone can get access to decent, affordable food in their local area? And given that we in the UK throw out 40% of the food between the farm and our houses, there's a huge amount that we can be doing about that. Now, the final two things that I'd like to have a look at are a bit less about facts and a bit more about us. They're about the way that we see the world. And they're about things that we often try and do to help make a difference. The first of those is the idea that we'll help by volunteering overseas. And to those people who've considered this or done that, I want to say, brilliant, that's absolutely wonderful. But when we think about trying to help out, we need to remember that trying to do something about an issue like poverty, it isn't about us. It's about people living in poverty themselves, and it's about what they're doing and what we can support them to do a little bit better. And so if we want to volunteer overseas, we need to make sure we ask ourselves some questions about why we want to do that and what value we're really going to add. Because as I travel around the country, I meet far too many people who are really keen, but like this next person, haven't necessarily thought a huge amount about it.
Yes, how can I help you?
I want to be an aid worker.
Really? Why?
Because I want to save the poor peoples.
What do you know about aid work?
I want to heal the world. I want to make it a better place.
That is a song lyric, not a reason. What do you know about aid work?
It is glamorous. I want to meet Bono. I want to save the children.
That is not how it works. Have you even thought about this?
Yes. I bought a white armband. I want to be an aid worker.
Do you know anything about poverty and development?
I read the book, The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs. I want to end poverty. It is my calling.
Okay, but you do not need to be an aid worker. You can do other things. Give money. Volunteer for charities here. Join campaigns to change laws that keep people poor.
Yes. I'm a volunteer. I went to Africa last summer and did aid work. I built a school. I taught English. I want to be an aid worker.
Now that's a little video that we put together last year that we hear a lot of people say exactly those things. And I want to say they're all fantastic things, but they all need context. Because going to another country for a month, if you don't speak the language, if you don't have any practical skills at building or teaching, and if you're only going to hang around for a month, isn't likely to actually make that much of a difference. You're going to learn a huge amount about it. And if you go in knowing that actually you might not be very much help at all, but you'll change your perspective, it could be a really valuable thing. This is my friend Mark, and 5 years ago, Mark and I went to Malawi together, and we went knowing that we wouldn't be particularly useful. We went to learn, we went to listen, we went to understand some of the challenges that local communities were facing and what they were doing. The locals said, well, you're here, give us a hand. They asked Mark to fill up some water, and you can see him here at a hand water pump. It took Mark 20 minutes to fill up one 20-litre tub. The ladies spent most of the time laughing. When Mark said, fine, you have a go at it, they filled up a 20-litre water jerry in about a minute and a half. Mark came away from that saying, I feel like I'm not really making a difference. And he was right. But what he took from that experience was that what he could do was phenomenal if he used his skills as a banker. He went away and learnt Indonesian after that, and he's just come back from 12 months working in Timor-Leste, in East Timor, supporting people running microfinance organisations to build better financial control systems. If you take the time to learn the language, you take the time to think about what you're doing, volunteering can be wonderful. People like Darcy here have spent years travelling the world, volunteering, learning a huge amount, but also contributing to communities. I think that if we take the approach that we need to first listen, recognise that communities themselves know a lot more than we do about these issues, then actually we can make a huge difference, but recognise that we're partners, not people who know more than others. And I'd like to finish with the final myth, which is about charity overheads. Most of us, I think, have been mugged by one of those charity stalkers on the street, asked for money, and the immediate question we want to ask is, well, how much are you going to spend in administration? And today I'd like to suggest that that's actually the wrong question to be asking. It's a little bit like asking an airline, how much money do they spend on safety? I don't actually mind how much money a charity spends on their overheads. In the same way, I don't mind how much EasyJet spends on safety, so long as they get me safely from one airport to the next one. Because at the end of the day, our obsession with asking charities about overheads means that they stop thinking about doing really good work on the ground. They stop thinking about making sure that kids can read and write, and make sure that 95 pence in every pound that you give them actually just gets sent to Africa. No time for monitoring, no time for checking, and no time to tell you actually what happened. So next time you're stopped by one of these charity muggers, what I'd like to suggest you do is ask them a different question. Ask them what success looked like. Ask them what proof you have to make sure that your money's really going to make a difference. And ask them how they know when they've failed and what they're going to do about it. Because all in all, actually we can make a huge difference. Because when we ask better questions, we ask questions like, can they read and write? We can start making sure that charities are focusing on what really matters, which is making sure that people living in poverty themselves have a chance to fight it. I want to finish with a couple of alternative suggestions to this idea that I've put out around these myths. First, Africa as a continent is rich, it's wealthy, it's wonderful. Too many Africans are poor because they've got bad governments and because we've got governments and systems that allow them to do that. If we're serious, what we need to do is start telling people about what's actually happening. Demonstrate that poverty is really getting better around the world in the vast majority of places and for the vast majority of people. To demonstrate that actually the best way to slow population growth is by making sure kids can go to school and making sure that more kids survive. The best way to reduce pressures on population, the best way to reduce pressures on food is to waste less food ourselves. And the best way to make sure we're really making a difference is to see that good intentions aren't enough, that we can make a huge difference. But only if we stop to ask a few questions first. Only if we stop to ask the question, is what I'm doing actually going to help? How's it going to help? Who am I going to help? And do they actually want my help? Thank you very much.